So in way of review, we talked last time about the priests. And so I've asked here, number one, I think this was on your lesson sheet, which of the following was not a responsibility of the priest before God? All right, letter B is the correct answer. I suppose there's a sense in which, in a sense, the priest was acting in an intercessory way. I think of Moses, for instance, pleading with God concerning the people when he went up on Mount Sinai and they disobeyed. But that really wasn't the role of the priest as such. It was, and these are the sections we looked at last time, submitting to God's authority and revealing his glory to the people in various ways. And certainly in the case of Nadab and Abihu, they accepted God's discipline, Leviticus chapter 10. All right, number two, indicate whether each of the following represents a requirement of the priesthood. What about letter A? Each priest had to undergo a vote of acceptance from the tribes of Israel. No. Which is to say, among other things, that this was not a democratic proposition. This was God directing things. What do we call that form of government? Theocracy, okay? Theos is the Greek word for God, so theocracy, God is ruling. And that's different from what we're accustomed to, where we have a choice in the matter, we decide certain things. God issued his word. He did make a covenant with the people, but he was the one making the terms of that covenant. Letter B, certain physical defects disqualified one from being a priest. Yes. Okay, we looked in chapter 21, or maybe it was at the end of chapter 22, where certain things were listed. And how do you account for that? Someone might say, well, that's not fair. Why would God disqualify somebody on the basis of something physical? Ed? Yes, and in that respect, it really matches with the kind of sacrifice he told them to offer, that the animals they were to bring were to be without blemish, without defect. And so in the same way, the priests who are serving are to meet that same requirement. Of course, that's not all that unusual in some respects when you think of people being drafted into the army, etc. There are certain requirements they have to meet or else they're discharged. So we see that in some other respects, but that would certainly account, among other things, for what God required of the priests. Yeah, Collie? Okay. Yes, yes. It certainly fit with the idea that you were offering something that in itself was a clean, pure type of sacrifice, but it was also the best that you had to offer. And that fits with what God was wanting from his people. Not just, yeah, let's go find something that's scraggly and I'm not going to keep anyway, so let's just offer that as a sacrifice. That was not the idea at all. Yeah, what would you offer to the governor or something like that? Which is to say that at least by that time, if not well before, that it seems that some people were trying to do that. So the reason for the requirement and the exhortation. Letter C, there were certain marriage and ceremonial requirements for the priests. Yeah, okay. So we looked at a number of those things, certain things that they couldn't do. If someone were to die in their family, they weren't able to just go and mourn like the average person would. And not sure about all the reasons for that, because God doesn't necessarily give us the reasons, and we'll talk about that a little bit tonight with some of the things that we look at. But he had certain requirements, kind of a bar that he wanted them to meet in terms of their service to him. Finally, the priests were to be spiritual leaders of Israel. Okay, I think all these things we've said about them suggest that yes, they were held to a high standard, and I believe it was Leviticus 10, right in the middle of that incident with Nadab and Abihu. Let's look at that again. Leviticus 10, verses 10 and 11. Somebody have that for us? Want to read that? Go ahead. Okay, so you're to teach and you're to distinguish between clean and unclean, holy and profane, and the teaching is to acquaint the people with that. When they go into the land, what's going to serve that purpose of the priest teaching the people? We haven't studied this, but what was the distribution when they went into the land? Yeah, 48 cities for the Levites, 6 of those cities of refuge, 3 on one side, 3 on the other of the Jordan, but 48 cities that were scattered throughout the land. And certainly suggests the idea that they were to be among all of the people and having this influence among them. So by design, God intends for his law to be taught to the people. He intends for them to obey it, and that's the expectation. Yeah, Derek? Yes. Yeah. Offering the best, Derek says. And the other thing that's interesting is you go back to the time of Noah and his family coming out from the flood, and you've got this mention made of clean and unclean. So some distinctions being made at a very early point in time. We're not filled in about all that information, but we'll talk about that in a moment as far as God making some of those distinctions. Okay, good. Number 3, I don't know that this one was on your sheet, but let's go back over these. What about these different offerings? What on the right side would fit with a burnt offering? Yeah, okay. Third one down, commitment to God. So kind of the giveaway is, I don't know that burnt necessarily implies that, but that fits this, that the entire offering is going to be burned, and the suggestion that this indicates a total commitment to God. What about a peace offering? Yeah, the first one, communion with God. So the idea of peace, think of fellowship. Some of that offering was eaten, some by the priest, at times some by the one offering it. And so it suggests this idea of communion between God. And so think of eating the Lord's Supper, the similar kind of thing that we do when we eat that. All right, the last two sound alike, sin offering. Which of those two do you think the sin offering had to do with? Again, embedded a little bit of a giveaway there. Okay, the last one, cleansing by God. When the sin is discovered, even if it's the priest or the people, why then an offering is to be made. And it uses some language about if someone sins unintentionally and then they find out that they've done that, they are to make this offering. So we're left with the guilt offering being another way of cleansing oneself. And so what's the additional idea here? Think of who's the wee little man? Huh. Zacchaeus. I wanted to say Lazarus. And again, we means little, so the wee man, the little man. Okay, so he said, well, if I've taken anything, I've restored it threefold. Well, that's according to what the law stipulated. So if you've done something and you've taken from someone or harmed something, then you're to restore to a certain degree what it is you took, in addition to an offering that you make. All right? So each of those has a purpose, and different combinations of those are offered at different times. And hard to keep up with all the minutia that's a part of that, but it's worth noting that there were purposes in each of these. And God is having the people offer them. And what's the message all of these are conveying? This is how the book of Leviticus starts. 7 chapters of offerings. What's the idea behind all of this? If you're gonna have fellowship with me right there in the tabernacle in the middle of the camp, then sin needs to be dealt with. But there are also blessings that are part of this relationship. Okay, good. We did talk about the feast and the holy days. Let's just see if we can rack our brains here and remember these. 7th day of each week is the Sabbath, which indicates, day of rest, and also the idea of fellowship with God. All right, first month, 14th day, Passover, okay? To take that lamb, this is the one that the family would do. They would take their own lamb, and they would kill that lamb and then spread the blood on the doorposts and then partake of the lamb. And then hard on the heels there, 15th to 21st day, what was the feast that follows this? Unleavened bread, which suggests what? Is there anything that we would think of if we think of unleavened bread? This hasty departure, which suggests, to me anyway, the idea that God allowed them to depart. And it happened immediately once Pharaoh said go. It wasn't as a result of some long protracted battle. Why, they picked up and they left. And there was no waiting. All right, then the 50th day after the Passover Sabbath is known as Pentecost, okay? And they offer the first fruits of their harvest, probably the grain harvest, the barley, the wheat. Okay, then you go how far out? First month, 7th month, half a year later, and we've got 3 days here, feast. Well, does it say feast? I don't remember. What's the first day? Feast of Trumpets, okay. And trumpets were used in different ways. Maybe this is symbolic of just alerting the people to something that's coming. I don't know that it spells out all the particulars there. 10th day of that 7th month. Day of Atonement. And what happens on this day? They make atonement for their sins by what particular action that only happens on this day? High priest goes in to the most holy place, makes atonement for himself, makes atonement for the people in the presence of God. And finally, the 15th to the 21st day, Feast of Booths or Tabernacles, and God wants them to remember that He provided for them out there in the wilderness, which is kind of looking forward because, yes, they've been in the wilderness up to this point, but they're going to be there a lot longer. So I think all of that is in mind. Okay, so really, when you boil that down, several things there, not all that hard to remember. And if you think of that first month, 7th month, and that Feast of Unleavened Bread and Feast of Booths, almost identical dates there, except one's first month, the other's the 7th month. One other one that we mentioned, Leviticus 25. This is not a feast week. It's a year, the year of Jubilee. And among other things, servants released, land returned. We didn't really go into detail there, but does that mean that somebody can sell their land at year 1 and then year 50, give me my land back? Now, there's actually stipulation, if you look in that chapter 4, somebody's purchased that land. Well, if they purchase at such and such a time, they're going to get some kind of remuneration for the length of time that they've had it in lieu of it going back to its original owner. Where does that come into play? Can you think of a biblical story that deals with that sort of thing? Well, it wasn't the year of Jubilee necessarily, but the idea of redeeming something back in terms of property. Ruth, is one place that happens, maybe elsewhere. Okay, and so we've said all along, here's the tabernacle in the middle of the camp. God wants to dwell with man, but only on the basis that this fellowship has to be made right in terms of man's sinfulness. Okay, any comments, any thoughts there? All right, the overview of Leviticus, we've suggested this structure, and so right in the middle there, as we'll look at 2 weeks from tonight, Day of Atonement. So if you kind of remember 3 words, you've got to fix on what the book's about. Ritual, priest, purity. So we've looked at the rituals, which had to do with the sacrifices and the feast days on the back end. Last time we looked at the priests, and so tonight we're going to talk about this idea of purity. Okay. So we've covered the first 4 of those 6 there, or I guess there's 7 with Day of Atonement. Let's go back to the priests and think about that. One thing I didn't mention last time, the left-hand column there, chapters 8 to 10, again, think what was happening in chapters 8 to 10. What was the occasion for chapter 10? What were Aaron and his brothers doing? Yeah, they were being cleansed, they were being ordained as priests, so they were first ordained with certain sacrifices and things and waited for 7 days, and then at the end of that 7 days, they were to offer other sacrifices to sort of cleanse the tabernacle and all of its furniture as they went in to worship. And that's the setting in which Nadab and Abihu offer what kind of fire? Profane, unauthorized, strange fire. Suggesting what? Yeah, not approved by God. God directed a certain kind of fire. They didn't offer that. Does it seem to you a little bit harsh that Nadab and Abihu were struck dead? Might seem that way. God didn't always react that way. Can you think of some other instances where he reacted in that way? Not necessarily with priests, but where something seems maybe a little bit extreme. Ian? Okay, Uzzah touching the ark when David's going to move the ark from where it's been to the city of Jerusalem that he's captured. Reaches out to keep it from falling to the ground, and he dies. Anybody else think of anything else? Yeah, Michael? Okay. Okay. All right, so there is instructions or description of what purpose that was serving. Good. Ian? Okay. 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 Yeah. I can think of another instance. I think you're right in that. Something that's at the outset. Ed, did you have a thought? Okay. Yeah, the New Testament counterpart would be Ananias and Sapphira who lie about how much they're giving and leave the impression that they're giving everything. And Peter says, you have the right to decide, but you've lied about it. One other example I can think of. Achan, okay. Joshua, it's not 6, that's where Jericho falls, 7 or 8. And in that case, Achan and his whole family, they stoned. I mean, it's very severe. And I think maybe what Ian mentions is a part of the clue. Again, it's not explained, but each of these seems to be at the outset of something. And God is sending a message about what he expects in terms of obedience. All right, good. Well, let's look at this last section. So chapters 11 to 15 have to do with what we're calling ritual purity, and I hope we'll see the contrast when we get to chapters 18 to 20 that describe moral purity. We've used those terms before. So in terms of animals that have to do with the land, do you remember what was off limits? And I will tell you that I'm not, what's the term? I'm certainly not a vet. I don't know much about animal world. I watch All Creatures Great and Small, but that doesn't qualify me to understand all this. But what's the distinction he makes? Those that do what and have what? Those that chew the cud and it's, yeah, their hoof is split, are animals that they can eat. So there are certain animals that are not included in that. Okay? Then you've got the sea, and what's the distinction there? You can't eat what? Or you can eat, yeah, okay, fins and scales. You can't see those fish swimming around the water there. Yeah. And then we've got birds of the air, and we've also got insects. I didn't put them in there. And so you've got clean and unclean. Okay, so you can't eat the clean, you're not to eat the unclean. So the question's always asked, what's the basis for this? Was it hygiene? Are there certain animals that are going to make them sick? And there's a statement over in Exodus 15 that might lend some credence to that. Do you remember the statement that God makes to Moses? He says he wants them to, well, I'm not at the right place here. You shall have none of these. Not ringing a bell. Exodus 15:26. If you will diligently listen to the voice of the Lord your God, and do that which is right in his eyes, and give ear to his commandments, and keep all his statutes, I will put none of the diseases on you that I put on the Egyptians. For I, the Lord, am your healer. So some have said, well, God's helping them. He's keeping them away from something that might damage them or be harmful. Which sounds plausible in a way, but what? What's a big but that might enter into that? What did Peter hear when he went up on the rooftop in Acts chapter 10? Kill and eat. And he says, I can't. It's unclean. He says, well, it's not unclean any longer. So it would seem if that was true then, it would be true here. So that may not be the reason. Others have said, well, it might be because the nations around them would eat certain animals, and so God's forbidding certain things that they may have partaken of. Or maybe there's a symbolism here, something to do with how an Israelite should live. Some have said it's just arbitrary, but God is commanding this. Or separation. God's teaching them that he wants them to keep his law and they can't be a part of this. Well, he certainly taught that kind of separation, whether that's why he's insisting on this we're not told? And the answer is we don't know. But he did make this distinction, and it lasted for a period of time, and then it was no more in terms of Jew and Gentile now both having a part in the gospel, and so there's no longer that distinction between them. Any thoughts that you have about any of that? Yes. Yes. Yeah. Okay. Okay. Yes. Okay. Yeah, whatever else we might say, I think that principle is certainly true, that God's authority is such that we're going to respect that. And we may not understand the reason why, but we're still to do that. And I think there's some parallels with things today. We don't always understand exactly why, but we're to do that. Okay. So clean and unclean, you can't see the pure. It's in white versus impure. So if you go to chapters 12 and 14, this applies to other areas such as childbirth and leprosy and mold in the house. So again, these might really seem odd to us. Why are these things being picked out as things that have to do with being clean or unclean, acceptable or not acceptable? And if you're not clean, if you're unclean, you need to, not clean, you need to do something in order to make that right. Well, as we've said before, these things we're talking about are not sinful. They're only sinful if someone ignores what God is saying and acts as if they're not defiled when this is said to defile them. In these cases, I think we can see some things. Mold today is a big concern, isn't it? And to have that in houses and maybe the damage it would do, I think we can at least think that might have something to do with that. What about leprosy, which is really a broader term than what we think of as just leprosy? What's true of at least some of those diseases? They're what? They're contagious. And so they can have a great effect. I mean, what have we just been through in terms of viruses and concerns about those? Okay, so there may well be other things to do with that, but God says, these are the laws that I want you to keep, and these are the concerns that I have. Okay, let's look on the other hand at what we're terming here moral purity, and you can see there is a difference between these. He says in verse 4 of chapter 18, you shall not do as they do, and he mentions both Egypt and Canaan. And so when you look at the list in chapter 18, a lot of those things have to do with what we would term incest, different relationships that are not authorized. And so we've termed it here sexual integrity. But I want you to notice verses 24 and 25 toward the end of that section. God says, do not make yourselves unclean by any of these things, for by all these the nations I am driving out before you have become unclean. And the land became unclean, so that I punished its iniquity, and the land vomited out its inhabitants. Now, would you say that's pretty strong language? I would say so. So notice what's involved there. The nations that are in the land have done these things. I'm driving them out. I'm not allowing you to do them. Because if you do them, what happens according to this? Yeah. It's not just coming into the tabernacle that's unclean. The land becomes unclean. And punishment results from that, and they are taken out of the land. And that's interesting in light of some other things. If you look at a couple of other passages that relate to that, what did God say to Abraham back in Genesis 15 that relates to the principle we're talking about there? Abraham said, how do I know that I'm going to receive this land that you've promised to me? And the very last detail in chapter 15, God says this will happen when what? Yeah. When the iniquity of the Amorites is complete, it'll take place. What does that suggest about this punishment that he promises Israel if they do it, and why they're being able to go into the land? Is this just some effort to, thrust his people in and take those people out, Ian? Okay. All right. Okay. So they've got to be faithful, they've got to be righteous, and that fits into that narrative we talked about. The narrative being what tends to happen with human history. Going upward, getting better, usually it's declining. And so God is anticipating, almost prophesying, that they will become so evil that he will take them out of the land. That fits with the flood. He destroyed humanity except for Noah and his family. Look at Deuteronomy 9. We'll see that later on when we get to Deuteronomy. He says to the people, Moses, don't say in your heart, we're going in because we're so great. The fact is, we're going in because they're so wicked. And God's allowing us to go in. But he expects you to obey him as you drive them out. And that all fits something that you've studied if you've been in the Romans class on Sunday morning. What does Romans 1 talk about that kind of fits this pattern here? What's that expression that Paul uses in Romans 1 about 3 times toward the end of the chapter? God did what? He gave them up to do whatever they wanted to do. And apparently that's what he does. I had never thought about that connection to this passage, but I think there is a connection. Here's Exhibit A about God giving people up to do what they want to do. The people in the land got so wicked that God had to judge them. And he allows his people to go in. But when they go in, they're to be righteous and not contaminate the land. That's kind of the terms of the lease. Yeah. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Same message, tabernacle's in the middle, the camp surrounds, you got to be holy, I am holy. Well, you get to the land, I'm giving you the land, here's the temple, okay, but you've got to be holy because I've given you this land, and if you are not holy, then ultimately you'll be taken out, which is what happens. Yes? Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, Deuteronomy 28 to 30, among other places, blessings and cursings. In fact, Leviticus 26 is a lot like those chapters, in that he says, God will bless you if you do this, he'll curse you if you do that. When you look at the curses, It's almost like a prophecy of what actually happens to them. They are taken out of the land. Okay, real quickly, chapter 19. I want you to look at chapter 19. It's a great chapter. It's right in the middle there, between 18 and 20. 20, we'll see in a moment, has some other things that have to do with sexual matters. But I want you to notice chapter 19. Just kind of skim down through there and tell me what sorts of things is chapter 19 concerned with. I mean, look at verses 3 and 4. What strikes you there right away? It almost sounds like what? 10 Commandments. Why, you need to revere your father and mother, and you need to keep the Sabbath, and don't turn to idols. And then he goes on and mentions some other things. Look at verse 11. You shall not steal. Verse 13. You shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. So we're right back to square one where we're talking about here are the basics that have to do with the law. This is what you're to do. But I want you to notice verses 17 and 18. You shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people, but what? You shall love your neighbor as yourself. How important is that one? That's the one that when they came to Jesus and said, what's most important? He said, love the Lord your God with heart, soul, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. Right here in the middle of the law, really in a chapter that has all sorts of things here. Look at verse 19. Don't let your cattle breed with different kind. Don't sow your field with two kinds of seed. It's like all these directives, and right here among them is love your neighbor as yourself. All these things are important. And God is giving them all as a part of what he expects. And it has to do in some cases with caring for the poor, social justice. We've heard that a lot today. Yeah. So we're not talking about just outward actions. We're talking about your inward thoughts as well. Okay, real quickly, look at chapter 20. Some of these sins that have to do, as we say, with sexuality. So chapters 18 and 20, but right in between there, all these directives that have to do with how you treat each other. And make sure you leave the corners of your field so that the poor people will have something to come and pick up and be able to eat. Okay? So, moral purity, ritual purity. We've got a couple of minutes. I'm gonna get to something that I keep threatening to, and we don't ever get there. Okay. So, thought questions. I don't think these were in your lessons, but let's just think about them quickly. How do these requirements, number one, foreshadow Jesus as our high priest? So we've been studying all these requirements. We come to the New Testament. You studied from the book of Hebrews. And I don't know that, there are a couple of references here from Hebrews. Well, 2 Corinthians 5:21, Jesus was made sin, him who knew no sin. So when Jesus came along, he wasn't sinful like the others. He had no sin, but he became a sin offering. I think the idea is there. We know Hebrews 4, we have a great high priest who's passed through the heavens. Now we'll talk about this with the Day of Atonement. He's passed through the heavens. Well, we think of his ascension, certainly. What else might you think of when he passes through the heavens? Think of that tabernacle. I know we haven't talked about the Day of Atonement. What's the great high priest do, or the high priest do? He passes through that veil that separates the holy from the most holy. Well, now Jesus has passed through the heavens into the presence of God. Where did the priest go? He went into the presence of God in that most holy place. Yeah. Was rent. Access. I mean, if you understand Leviticus and all these regulations and rules, if you have an idea of that, then All these other things make a whole lot of sense. Look at Hebrews 7:25 to 28. Contrast Jesus, the great high priest. Notice verse 28. Holy, innocent, unstained, separated from sinners, exalted. He doesn't have to offer daily sacrifices for his own sins and the sins of the people. He did it one time for all time. And notice he's able to save, verse 25, those who draw near to God through him, and he lives to make intercession for them. Okay, so we'll study that kind of serve as a preview for chapters 16 and 17, 2 weeks from tonight, and we'll look at that Day of Atonement, and we're gonna focus on Hebrews 9. You might read through that as well, because I think there's a lot of correlation there. Okay, we'll stop there.